They thought it was just a faded tattoo on an old man's arm. But when the highest-ranking general walked in and snapped a salute, the airmen realized they weren't mocking a stranger. They were mocking a legend. Asterisk, the commissary buzzed. With its usual life families chatting over grocery lists, young recruits rushing in for snacks, the rhythmic beeping of scanners echoing at the checkout lanes, but no one paid much attention to the old man moving slowly down the aisle, his cart half empty, his steps steady but heavy with the weight of years. His back was slightly bent, his shoulders rounded, yet his posture still held a quiet discipline that didn't fade with age. Every movement had a calm precision, like muscle memory from a life where mistakes had cost lives. He wore worn jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and a faded cap with the ghost of an embroidered flag nearly rubbed away with time. His eyes, pale but sharp, scanned the shelves with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that rushing was never the answer. When he stretched to reach a box from the higher shelf, the sleeve of his shirt slipped back, revealing the blurred but unmistakable outline of an old tattoo-crossed rifles. Beneath a banner of numbers, the ink faded but powerful, a silent testimony. Etched into his skin, it was then that two young airmen, barely out of training and still wearing the careless arrogance of youth, noticed him. One of them elbowed the other, nodding toward the tattoo with a smirk that spread quickly across his face. "Check that out," he muttered just loud enough for others nearby to hear. "Looks like some drunk old biker ink. Bet he tells people it's military just to look important." His friend chuckled, adding, "Yeah, right. If he ever served, it was probably peeling potatoes." Guys like him loved pretending they were warriors. Their laughter rang too loud in the aisle, sharp and mocking against the quiet dignity of the man they mocked. A few shoppers frowned, glancing toward the old man, but no one intervened, and the airmen grew bolder, their words dripping with disrespect. The veteran didn't respond. His face remained calm, his movements deliberate. As if their cruelty simply bounced off him, he picked up his cereal box, placed it neatly in his cart, and began pushing forward, ignoring the Snickers trailing behind him. His silence wasn't weakness, it was a choice, born from a lifetime of learning when to speak and when to let actions do the talking. What the young men didn't know, what no one around them realized, was that the story inked on that arm was not a barroom tale, but a history carved from blood, sacrifice, and honor. And though they laughed now, though they saw only an old man in a grocery store, it would not be long before that silence was broken and the truth forced them, and everyone else, to see him for who he truly was. Asterisk, the old man guided his cart slowly toward the dairy section, his movements steady, unfazed by the whispers trailing behind him. But the two young airmen weren't finished. They exchanged a mischievous glance, the kind born not of courage but of ignorance, and quickened their steps until they were right beside him. One leaned casually against the cooler door, blocking his path, while the other folded his arms with a smirk that carried the weight of arrogance more than authority. "Hey, old-timer," the taller one said, his voice loud enough for nearby shoppers to turn their heads. "That tattoo, what's it supposed to be? Some kind of war story?" The veteran looked at him, his pale blue eyes calm but unwavering, a gaze so steady that the airman shifted slightly under its quiet pressure. "It's just ink." The old man replied softly, his voice even, neither defensive nor proud. Just a simple truth offered without anger. The second airman chuckled, stepping closer. "Ink? Man, I've seen tougher tattoos at frat parties. Let me guess you tell people you were special forces, right? Bet you never even made it past basic." Their laughter stung the air, sharp and cruel, and for a moment it seemed the entire commissary held its breath, the quiet hum of conversation dimming into silence as eyes began to follow the scene. Still, the veteran didn't react with the anger they hoped to provoke. Instead, he adjusted the brim of his faded cap, his face unreadable, as if their words were no more than the buzzing of flies on a summer day. His silence unsettled them. More than any outburst could have, it left them standing in the echo of their own bravado, uncertain and yet too stubborn to back down. "You know," the taller one pushed, leaning closer, "people like you give real vets a bad name. Wearing some story on your skin, walking around like you earned it. But we see through it. We know a fake when we see one. The veteran's hand gripped his cart handle, the knuckles pale but steady and in his chest. His heartbeat remained calm, steady, like the rhythm of a soldier still on watch. He let the insult settle in the air, let their words reveal more about them than about him, then spoke, his voice quiet but carrying weight. Respect isn't given by your rank or your age. It's something you learn, or it's something life teaches you the hard way. The words, simple and unshaken, cut sharper than any anger could. The airmen blinked, their smirks faltering as the truth in his tone pressed against their bravado. Around them, the silent crowd leaned in, sensing the shift in the air. The veteran didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, didn't explain. He just left the words hanging like a stone in still water, rippling outward as he pushed his cart forward, leaving the two young men in the wake of their own humiliation. The commissary seemed to shrink as the veteran's words echoed in the air, rippling through the silence like a stone dropped into still water. Shoppers who had been pretending to browse now stood frozen, their carts idle, their eyes fixed on the narrow aisle where arrogance met quiet strength. The two airmen, flushed and restless, glanced at one another, their smirks crumbling but pride refusing to let them back down. The taller one cleared his throat, forcing a sneer to return. "That's real cute, old man. Talking about respect when you've clearly forgotten yours. You don't even deserve to be in uniform's shadow." His words fell flat, but he pressed on, louder now, as if volume could rebuild the authority he felt slipping away. The veteran paused. His cart stopped beside a shelf of milk cartons, his back straight despite the weight of years on his shoulders. He didn't need to speak. His silence was its own weapon, a mirror reflecting the airmen's immaturity back at them. The younger of the two, restless under the gaze of so many witnesses, jabbed his finger toward the faded tattoo on the man's forearm, the ink blurred by time but still sharp in its meaning. "This," he scoffed, "this is nothing. Some washed-up mark that doesn't mean squat anymore. You probably got it just to impress people. What war did you fight, huh? Comic book wars." Their laughter was hollow, desperate to regain control. But the crowd didn't join them. Instead, heads shook in quiet disapproval, murmurs of discontent rising like an unseen tide. The veteran shifted his weight, turning just enough to face them, his eyes steady, his expression carved from stone. "You boys have no idea what it cost," he said softly, almost as if speaking to himself. But the weight in his tone carried across the aisle. The airmen faltered, their bravado thinning under the truth in his voice. Yet their pride clung to defiance, refusing to retreat in front of so many watching eyes for a moment. The entire commissary was a stage, tension tightening every breath, every heartbeat. The old man's calm presence stood in stark contrast to their swagger, exposing it for what it was: youthful arrogance masquerading as strength. Then, as if fate itself had been waiting, the automatic doors at the front of the commissary slid open, and a hush fell deeper than before. A figure entered, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed not in the casual attire of shoppers but in the immaculate uniform of a 4-star general, every ribbon and medal gleaming beneath the fluorescent lights. His polished shoes clicked against the floor, each step deliberate, commanding, and with every stride the tension grew until the two airmen stiffened. Instinctively, their mockery drying in their throats, the veteran didn't move, didn't speak. But the crowd knew something was about to happen that none of them would ever forget. The commissary, moments before alive with whispers and restless shifting, seemed to hold its breath as the 4-star general advanced down the aisle, his gaze sweeping over the stunned crowd before fixing on the old veteran. Every shopper instinctively straightened, and even the airmen, still trying to cling to scraps of defiance, snapped into rigid postures, their mockery dissolving into nervous silence. The general's steps echoed with authority, each click of his polished shoes resonating like a drumbeat of judgment. He reached the end of the aisle and stopped just a few feet from the veteran, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man's face. Then the faded tattoo inked onto his arm. The pulse stretched, heavy and unbearable, until the general suddenly drew himself to full height, his chest expanding, his jaw tightening. In that instant, The atmosphere cracked open. With a single gesture, the general lifted his right hand, fingers sharp and precise, and delivered a salute so crisp it cut through the silence like thunder. Gasps erupted from the crowd, a collective shock that rippled through the commissary as the realization struck. This was no ordinary veteran. The airmen blinked in disbelief, their faces draining of color, the smirks they had worn only minutes before replaced with wide-eyed panic. One of them shifted awkwardly as if to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The general's salute lingered, firm and unwavering, his eyes burning with respect reserved only for legends. Slowly, almost reverently, the veteran returned the salute, his movement steady despite the years etched into his body, and for that moment, time itself seemed to freeze to men bound by shared battles and sacrifices invisible to everyone else in the room. The crowd erupted into murmurs, some raising their phones to record, others too awestruck to move. Knowing they were witnessing something rare, something sacred, the general lowered his hand, but his voice carried strong and unyielding as he turned slightly toward the two airmen. You stand in the presence of a man who carried this nation on his back, long before you wore those uniforms. Show him the respect he earned, respect that outranks your arrogance. The airmen dropped their gazes, shame flooding their expressions, their pride shattered beyond repair. The veteran remained silent, his eyes calm, his dignity untouched, but the lesson hung heavier than any words could have delivered. The commissary no longer felt like a grocery store, it had become a courtroom of honor, and the verdict was clear. By the time the general stepped aside, the truth had been branded into everyone's memory. Some heroes don't need medals on their chest to command a salute, they carry their valor on their skin, in the ink of a story too powerful to ever fade. Asterisk, the stunned silence lingered long after the general's words, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above, and the muffled sound of carts creaking in distant aisles. The two junior airmen, who had once strutted so boldly, now stood rooted in shame, their cheeks flushed crimson, the weight of their arrogance pressing heavily on their shoulders. One of them finally swallowed hard, his voice trembling as he forced the words out. "Sir, but he faltered, unable to finish under the piercing gaze of both the general and the veteran. The older man, still standing straight with the quiet poise of someone long accustomed to scrutiny, simply raised a hand, silencing the young airman before he could continue. "You owe me nothing," the veteran said softly, his tone calm but edged with an authority that silenced the commissary once more. "What you owe is to the uniform you wear, to the men and women who bled for it, who carried its weight long before you." His voice carried no bitterness, only the weight of truth, and it cut deeper than any scolding could. The other airman, his hands trembling slightly, finally managed to speak. "We were wrong. We didn't know who you were." At this, the veteran's expression shifted, his eyes softened, but his reply struck harder than any rebuke. "That's exactly the problem, son. You shouldn't have to know who I am to show respect. The uniform you wear should remind you every day that honor isn't about rank or medals or even names. It's about recognizing sacrifice, no matter how hidden." A murmur spread among the onlookers, many nodding in agreement, the lesson hitting home not just for the airmen, but for every witness. The general, arms folded across his chest, gave a small nod of approval, letting the veteran's words settle like a gavel striking final judgment. The airmen's arrogance had melted away, leaving only humility and regret. Their youthful pride stripped down to something raw and honest. They stood there, chastened, their eyes downcast, not from humiliation alone, but from understanding. The veteran did not gloat, nor did he linger on their shame. Instead, he turned to the crowd, his quiet dignity commanding more reverence than a shouted order ever could. "Respect is the simplest thing we can give each other," he said, his voice steady. "But when it's missing, it leaves scars deeper than any wound." With that, he adjusted his cap, nodded once to the general, and began pushing his cart forward, leaving the aisle heavy with silence and the young airmen standing in the wreckage of their own lesson forever changed by the Old man's grey dot as the commissary slowly resumed its quiet rhythm. The general stepped away from the stunned crowd and followed the veteran, his polished boots clicking softly against the tile. "Colonel," he said firmly, his voice carrying a mix of authority and reverence. The older man paused, turning his head slightly, the faintest trace of a wry smile tugging at his weathered face. "It's been a long time since anyone called me that," he replied. The general's presence seemed to grow heavier, his salute sharp and deliberate as though acknowledging not just a man but an entire legacy. The murmurs in the crowd swelled again, curiosity rippling through them. "Colonel." The word hung in the air, reshaping the old man before their very eyes. The general continued, his voice resonant and unyielding. "Ladies and gentlemen, this man is not just a veteran. This is Colonel James O'Callaghan, decorated with the Silver Star, the Distinguished, Flying Cross and Purple Hearts. He commanded one of the most daring rescue operations in Southeast Asia, saving lives when others thought the mission was impossible." Gasps echoed across the commissary. The airmen's faces turned ashen as they realized the full weight of the man they had mocked. The veteran shifted uncomfortably, clearly uneasy with the spotlight, his eyes scanning the floor rather than meeting the awe of those around him. "That was a lifetime ago," he muttered, his humility as intact as his dignity. But the general shook his head, his voice rising with emotion. "No, sir. Time doesn't erase honor, and it doesn't fade sacrifice. Men like you are the reason I stand in this uniform today. You built the foundation we walk on, and it's about time people are reminded of it." The commissary, once filled with chatter and motion, now stood frozen in a silence that felt sacred. Mothers clutched their children's hands, fathers straightened, unconsciously, and even the airmen who had once sneered now looked on with wet eyes, their arrogance shattered into something resembling reverence. Colonel Callahan's tattoo, the very mark they had mocked, suddenly carried the weight of a nation's history, a reminder that ink was not just decoration but sometimes a testament carved in flesh and memory. The veteran exhaled slowly, nodding, once toward the general, then lifting his gaze to the young men who had wronged him. "Learn this lesson well," he said simply, his voice low but unshakable, "because one day it will be your turn to carry the burden and you'll pray. The next generation shows you more grace than you showed me." With that, he turned, disappearing into the crowd, leaving behind silence, respect, and a story that no one present would ever forget. The commissary felt different after Colonel Callahan's departure, as though the walls themselves held onto the silence he left behind. The two junior airmen, who only minutes ago had worn smirks and arrogance like armor, now stood stiff and hollow, their pride stripped bare in front of their peers. The weight of their mockery clung to them heavier than any rucksack they had ever shouldered. One of them, Airman Brooks, swallowed hard, the knot in his throat refusing to loosen. We called him a fake," he whispered, almost to himself, his voice cracking under the shame. His companion, Airman Davis, shifted uncomfortably, staring at the spot where the old man had stood, the faded tattoo now etched in his memory as if branded into his conscience. "He could have let us keep making fools of ourselves," Davis muttered, guilt gnawing at him. "But he didn't. He gave us a chance to learn." Around them, the crowd slowly dispersed, whispers of the revelation still passing between shoppers, who would carry the story home to their families, ensuring that the lesson would ripple far beyond these walls. The general remained at the end of the aisle, his arms folded as he studied the two young men. His gaze wasn't angry, it was stern, disappointed, the way a father might look at sons who had forgotten their upbringing. "You boys thought you saw weakness in him," the general said finally, stepping closer, his voice low but filled with authority. "But what you really saw was strength you couldn't recognize, the kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself because it already has." Brooks' face burned red, shame prickling like fire under his skin, while Davis lowered his eyes, unable to meet the general's steady gaze. "You've been given a gift today," the general continued, his tone softening slightly. "Few people ever get to meet living history, let alone be humbled by it. You can walk away from this moment embarrassed, or you can let it change you, shape you into men worthy of the uniform you wear." The words pierced deeper than any reprimand could, and for the first time, the two airmen understood that their arrogance had not just been disrespectful, it had been dishonorable. They straightened their postures not out of pride, but out of a newfound resolve, their young shoulders suddenly feeling the weight of the legacy they had mocked. "Yes, sir," they both answered in unison, their voices heavy but sincere. The general gave them a curt nod before turning away, leaving them to their thoughts. As the automatic doors closed behind him, Brooks exhaled shakily and whispered, "We'll do better." Davis nodded, his eyes still fixed on the empty aisle, where the ghost of a quiet hero lingered, a silent reminder that true valor humbles, teaches, and never fades. Asterisk. The days that followed at the base were quieter for Airmen Brooks and Davis, but within that quiet lived a shift that everyone around them could sense. Gone were the careless jokes and smug remarks that had once rolled so easily off their tongues. Now, their conversations were clipped, thoughtful, and edged with humility. The commissary incident lingered in their minds like a scar, not visible but always there, tender to the touch, each time they passed the spot where they had mocked the old veteran. The memory burned, pushing them to walk straighter, speak softer, and think harder. They started arriving earlier to their duties, their uniforms sharper, their boots cleaner, as if trying to honor the man they had once dishonored by ensuring no one could accuse them of failing their own. Even their peers noticed the transformation. "You two different or something?" One fellow airman teased in the barracks, but instead of snapping back, Brooks just shrugged, saying simply, "We learned something we should have known already." The comment hung heavy, its meaning obvious though unspoken. Their instructors, too, saw the change, an eagerness to listen, a willingness to serve, and a humility that hadn't existed before. Late one evening, Davis sat on his bunk, staring at the dim ceiling light as he muttered, "It wasn't just about him, it was about us. We forgot why we wear this uniform." Brooks nodded from across the room, his jaw set as he replied, "That tattoo meant something we couldn't even begin to understand. But now I want to earn the right to stand in the same room as men like him." That night, neither of them slept easily, but it wasn't guilt keeping them awake, it was determination. Slowly, they began to look for opportunities to show respect instead of arrogance, opening doors for older veterans on base, volunteering for extra assignments, listening when others spoke instead of waiting to be heard. The memory of the general's salute to the old man replayed in their minds like a film on repeat, each frame reminding them that greatness was measured not in words but in deeds. Weeks later, when Brooks and Davis stood in line at the commissary, again they spotted another elderly veteran in a wheelchair, his cap embroidered with the name of a long-past war. Without exchanging a word, both men stepped forward, offering to help carry his groceries to his car. The veteran's smile was small, but the gratitude in his eyes spoke volumes. For Brooks and Davis, it wasn't about redemption anymore, it was about respect, and the vow they had silently made to never again confuse age with weakness, or humility with insignificance. In that moment, they finally understood what true service meant. It was a crisp Saturday morning when fate brought Brooks and Davis face to face once more with the man they had once mocked. The commissary door slid open, and there he was, the elderly veteran, his back a little stooped, his steps measured, but his presence just as commanding as the day that had silenced the entire room. His faded tattoo, partly hidden under his sleeve, peeked out like a quiet badge of honor, a story written in ink that neither time nor ridicule could erase. Brooks froze mid-step, his arms loaded with supplies, while Davis felt his stomach twist, the weight of their first encounter flooding back in sharp detail. Yet instead of smirking or hiding, they straightened their posture, their uniforms neat, their expressions respectful, as though they wanted to show the man he had changed them without ever intending to. The veteran's eyes scanned the commissary and paused on them, his gaze steady and unreadable. For a tense moment, the silence was louder than any words could have been, the air thick with unspoken history. Then, with a faint nod, he moved closer, setting his basket down and extending a weathered hand. Brooks and Davis stepped forward quickly, each reaching to shake it, their grips firm but careful, as if afraid to break something sacred. "You boys look different," the veteran said, his voice gravelly but strong, carrying a note of approval that struck deeper than any reprimand could have. "Difference good." Neither airman dared to boast or explain. They simply nodded, their throats tight, the lessons of humility and honor still fresh in their minds. Around them, a few shoppers paused, curious at the quiet exchange. But this time there was no mockery, no confrontation, only respect that rippled through the room like a current. Davis finally found his voice, saying softly, "Sir, we owe you an apology. But more than that, we owe you better." The veteran studied them for a long moment, then gave a slight smile, one that seemed to forgive without forgetting. "Just remember," he replied, "you wear the uniform for more than yourselves. Don't ever forget the weight of it." With that, he picked up his basket and moved along, leaving Brooks and Davis standing tall, their hearts pounding not from shame but from pride in the chance to do better. As the old soldier disappeared down the aisle, both men realized this was no coincidence, it was a second chance, a moment that would guide them for the rest of their lives. The commissary seemed to pause in time when the automatic doors opened again, and a sharp click of polished boots echoed against the tile floor. Heads turned instantly. Conversations fell into whispers, and the presence of authority filled the air as a 4-star general, his uniform immaculate, his chest lined with ribbons of every campaign, stepped inside. His eyes, sharp and deliberate, swept across the room until they found the elderly veteran standing quietly at the end of an aisle, his basket balanced in one hand. Brooks and Davis, who still lingered nearby, felt the weight of the moment press down on them. They had been bracing themselves for another lesson, but what unfolded went beyond anything they could have imagined. The general moved with deliberate strides toward the old man, and as the crowd instinctively made space, silence fell like a heavy curtain. Without hesitation, the general stopped just a few feet away, removed his cap, and snapped into a flawless salute that cracked like thunder in the stillness. Gasps rippled through the commissary, some shoppers covering their mouths in awe, others clutching their phones to capture what they knew was history unfolding before their eyes. The old veteran did not rush to return the gesture. His hand rose, slowly, respectfully, his weathered frame straightening with the quiet dignity of someone who had earned every ounce of that honor. When their salutes met, it was not a ritual of rank but a recognition of sacrifice, of battles fought and burdens carried that few could truly understand. Brooks and Davis stood rooted, their spines stiff, their own hands snapping to salute in unison, humbled to be witnesses to something far greater than themselves. The general's voice broke the silence, steady and commanding, yet tinged with reverence. "Gentlemen, you stand before one of the finest warriors this nation has ever produced. Don't mistake yous for weakness or quiet for insignificance. Some heroes don't wear their valor on their sleeves, they carry it in their scars, their silence, and their ink." The words struck like steel, searing themselves into the hearts of every airman present. The old veteran's faded tattoo, once mocked, now glowed like a sacred symbol, a testament written not in arrogance but in survival. The general lowered his salute, extended his hand, and with deep respect said, "Welcome home, brother." The veteran clasped it firmly, his eyes shining with a humility that outshone any medal. And just like that, the commissary erupted not with applause but with reverent silence, a collective understanding that they had witnessed true honor. For Brooks and Davis, it was the day they finally understood what service meant. For everyone else, it was the reminder that heroes walk among us unrecognized until the moment respect demands the world stand still.